The door did not creak open, it exploded inward, torn from its top hinge by a single gauntleted fist, and Jacob Dawson found himself staring down the haft of a war hammer with a woman's fierce amber eyes glaring over the top of it. "You are the one they call Dawson," she said, voice low and rough as gravel dragged over stone. "The man who built his little fort of logs on Frostgate Pass and dares to call it his own." Jacob set down the ladle he had been using to stir the evening stew, slow and deliberate, the way a man moves when he does not want to startle a mountain cat that has wandered into his kitchen. The wind howled through the broken doorway, dragging snow across the floorboards in ghostly ribbons, and the firelight caught on the orc woman's tusks, on the dark green of her skin, on the leather and steel that clung to a body built for violence, and yet he could not help but notice, even with a hammer's head hovering a foot from his skull, built with an undeniable and dangerous beauty. "I am," he said. "Would you like some stew before you kill me or after? I find things go better on a full stomach either way." For a long moment she only stared at him, as if the words had come out sideways and she was still waiting for the one she expected, the pleading, the terror, the scramble for a weapon. None of it came. Jacob Dawson simply looked at her, a broad-shouldered man with a scar through one eyebrow and hands roughened by forge work and old fights, and he waited, as calm as the banked coals behind him. "I was sent here to frighten you," Murbul Doomhammer said, and there was something almost affronted in the way she said it, as though his failure to be frightened was a personal insult. "My father commands the Doomhammer clan of Blackridge Camp. He wants this crossing empty before the thaw. You are meant to run, human, or burn." "I heard you the first time," Jacob said, and reached for a second bowl from the shelf beside the hearth. "Sit. The bench there doesn't bite, and neither, it seems, do you not yet anyway." He was aware dimly that he ought to be more careful. He had spent a decade of his life in the fighting pits of Ashford Hollow, had broken bones and taken blows that still ached in the cold, had learned to read the weight shift of an opponent's shoulders before they even knew they meant to strike. He read it now in her, the tension coiled through her arm, the readiness in her stance, and he knew, with the same certainty that had once told him when a killing blow was coming, that if he flinched, if he begged, she would strike. So he did not flinch. He set the second bowl on the rough-hewn table across from his own chair and pulled the bench out an inch, an invitation instead of a command. Murbul Doomhammer stood in the wreck of his doorway, snow swirling around her boots, her war hammer still raised, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not know what to do with her own hands. She was a magnificent and terrible sight, and Jacob could admit that to himself even with his life balanced on the edge of her decision. She stood a full head taller than him, her frame corded with muscle beneath fitted leathers the color of dried blood, a breastplate of hardened hide studded with iron rivets that hugged close to her waist and flared at the hip, cinched with a wide belt that carried a long knife and a coil of rope. Fur lined the collar of her cloak, dark and thick, and beneath it her arms were bare to the cold as though the winter itself did not dare touch her. Her black hair had been bound into warrior's braids threaded with small bones and beads that clicked faintly when she moved, and her tusks, small and sharp, gleamed white against the deep green of her skin. She smelled of snow and leather and something sharper beneath, like a blade freshly whetted. "You are not afraid," she said, and it was not quite a question. "I've been afraid before," Jacob said, "plenty of times. I fought in the pits at Ashford Hollow for 9 years, if that means anything to you, and I've stood across from men twice my size who wanted nothing more than to open my throat for a purse of silver. I know what fear tastes like." He met her eyes. "It doesn't taste like stew. Sit down and eat, and if you still want to burn my house down after, I won't stop you, though I'd rather you didn't. I only just got the roof to stop leaking." Something in her face flickered, not quite a smile, but its shadow gone as quickly as it came. She lowered the hammer, though she did not set it down, and she did not sit, not yet. "You mock me." "I'm feeding you," Jacob said. "There's a difference, though I understand it might not look it from where you're standing." Outside, the wind screamed along the pass, rattling the shutters, and somewhere in the dark beyond the broken door a wolf called out and was answered. The way station sat alone on the shoulder of the mountain, the last roof between the frozen wilds and the long road down to Ashford Hollow, and Jacob Dawson had built it with his own hands 3 years past, log by log, stone by stone, because after 9 years of breaking men for coin in a fighting pit, he had wanted nothing more than 4 walls that were his, and a door that opened for whoever needed shelter from the cold, human or otherwise. It was that door now hanging broken from one hinge that had made him unpopular with certain folk down in Ashford Hollow, who did not care for a man who fed orc traders the same bread he fed their own wagon drivers. Murbul Doomhammer looked at the bowl of stew. She looked at the man who had offered it, who sat now with his own spoon already lifted, entirely unbothered, as if a 7-foot orc enforcer standing in his ruined doorway with a war hammer was the most natural thing in the world to share a meal with. She sat. She did not know why. Later, lying awake in the war camp with the memory gnawing at her, she would tell herself it was strategy, that a fed and comfortable enemy reveals more than a frightened one, that she was simply doing her duty in a new way. But in that moment in the firelight, with the smell of rabbit and barley rising warm between them, she sat because some small and long-starved part of her wanted, for one meal, to be looked at without fear or hatred, only with that same calm, level patience he might have shown any traveler come in from the snow. "This is good," she said, grudging after the first spoonful. "I've had worse reviews," Jacob said, "mostly from men trying not to bleed on my floor." She almost laughed. She caught it before it escaped, turned it into a low huff through her nose, but Jacob saw the corner of her mouth twitch, and something in his chest, long dormant, stirred at having caused it. "You were sent to scare me off this pass," he said, when the silence had stretched long enough that he judged it safe to speak of it again. "I'd like to hear why, if you're willing to tell me before you go back and tell your father whether it worked." Murbul set down her spoon. The warmth of the stew, the fire, the strange steadiness of the man across from her, it had loosened something in her tongue that duty alone would never have touched. "There is an old accord," she said slowly, "between my clan and your people. After the last war, when both sides had lost enough sons and daughters that neither wanted to count them anymore, the elders drew lines on a map and swore this pass would remain open to both, a road of trade and not of blood. But the humans of Ashford Hollow speak now of building a garrison fort here, on this ridge, to hold the crossing against my people entirely. My father believes that if the human who already sits here is driven off first, there will be no foundation to build a fort upon and the humans will look elsewhere. He sent me because I am his enforcer. I do not fail. And if I don't run, then I have failed," she said, and there was an old, tired weight in the words that told him this was not the first time such failure had frightened her more than any battle. "And my father does not forgive failure easily, not even from his own blood." Jacob turned that over slowly. "You're his daughter." "I am the Doomhammer," she said, lifting her chin, some of the old fire returning. "I have broken the arm of a man who dared question my father's rule in open council. I have led raiding parties against the Ashfang wolves who prey on our southern herds and returned with more of them dead than my own. I do not lose. I did not expect." She stopped herself, jaw tightening. "You didn't expect a man to offer you a seat," Jacob finished for her gently. "No," she admitted, and the word came out smaller than anything she had said since kicking down his door. "I did not." They sat a while longer in a silence that was, strangely, not uncomfortable, the fire cracking and settling, the wind gradually losing its fury outside. When at last she rose to leave, ducking beneath the broken lintel of the doorway she herself had ruined, she paused on the threshold and looked back at him. "I will tell my father you were not frightened," she said. "That will not please him. He may send someone else next, someone less inclined to accept a bowl of stew instead of a burned roof." "Then I hope it's you who comes back," Jacob said, and meant it more than he expected to. "I'll have the door fixed by then. "You're welcome to knock properly if you like." She did not answer that. But she did not slam what remained of the door either, only stepped out into the dark and the snow. And Jacob Dawson stood a long while in the ruin of his doorway, watching the place where she had gone, feeling something he had not felt in years. Not since before the pits, before the blood and the coin and the friend he had killed with his own 2 hands in a bout that had gone wrong in ways he still dreamed about. He felt, absurdly, hopeful. He spent the better part of the next morning rehanging the door. Old Fenwick, the trapper who came through twice a month with pelts to trade and gossip to spread thicker than the pelts themselves, found him at it with a mouth full of nails and an expression Fenwick had never once seen on the retired fighter's face. "You're smiling," Fenwick said, swinging down off his mule with the particular creak of a man well past 60 winters. "Man alive, Dawson, I don't believe I've seen you smile since you came down off the circuit. What in the frozen hells happened to your door?" "An orc happened to my door," Jacob said, around the nails. Fenwick's white eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "An orc raid, and you're smiling about it." "She was sent to fright me off the pass," Jacob said, spitting the nails into his palm and driving the last one home with 3 solid strikes of the hammer. "I fed her stew instead." Fenwick stared at him for a long moment, then began to laugh, a wheezing, delighted sound that echoed off the mountainside. "You beautiful fool, you beautiful, stubborn fool. You know the Doomhammer clan's enforcer could take your head off with one swing of that hammer of hers, don't you? Everyone down in Ashford Hollow knows the name. Murbul Doomhammer, undefeated in single combat since she was old enough to lift a blade. And you fed her stew." "Best decision I've made in years," Jacob said, and there was no arguing with the look of quiet, stubborn contentment on his face, so Fenwick didn't try. He only shook his head, muttering about madmen and mountain air, and unloaded his pelts to trade for salt and dried meat as he always did, while Jacob went back to admiring his newly rehung door as though it were a piece of fine art. But beneath the town's gossip, beneath Fenwick's teasing, there was a harder truth Jacob knew well. Ashford Hollow did not love orc kind, not after the wars, not after the raids that had burned outlying farms within living memory. Men there spat at the mention of the Doomhammer name, and more than one had told Jacob to his face that his habit of trading fair with orc caravans, of letting them shelter beneath his roof same as any human traveler, would see him burned out one day, human sympathizer that he was. He had shrugged off such talk for 3 years. It had never once made him afraid. It was, however, about to become considerably more complicated. Murbul returned to her father's camp with her report, and Chief Goreth Doomhammer, a mountain of an orc himself, scarred across one tusk from some ancient duel, listened to her account with a stillness that unsettled her more than any shout would have. "He fed you," Goreth said at last, from the great carved chair at the center of Blackridge Camp, hide tents rising in tiered rings around him, smoke curling from a dozen fire pits into the frozen night sky. "And you sat, and you ate, and the human still stands on our pass this morning unafraid. He did not run, father. He is not like the others." "He is exactly like the others," Goreth said, "save that he has found a clever way to survive that none before him thought to try. Kindness as a weapon. It has worked on my own daughter, it seems, and that troubles me more than any blade could." Murbul's chin lifted, old habit, old pride. "It is not a weapon that worked on me, father. I am simply what?" Goreth's eyes narrowed. "Careful enforcer. I know your face too well to be fooled by it." She said nothing, and that silence told him more than words could have. Goreth Doomhammer sat back in his carved chair and considered the fire a long moment, the flames throwing shifting light across the scars on his face. He was not, whatever the humans of Ashford Hollow believed, a man and orc who loved war for its own sake. He had buried too many kinsmen in the last conflict to relish another. But he was also a chieftain, and a chieftain thought in terms of land and leverage, and an idea had begun to take shape in his mind that he turned over slowly, the way a smith turns raw ore before deciding what blade it might become. "There is an old custom," he said at last, "from before the war. When two peoples wish to settle a dispute over land without spilling blood, a claim bond could be made a formal courtship between a person of standing from each side, recognized by both councils, that would settle the matter of the land beneath the courted pair's protection, until such time as the bond was broken or made permanent. It has not been invoked in 3 generations. But it is written still in the old treaty scrolls, and the humans of Ashford Hollow cannot break an accord signed by their own ancestors without shaming themselves before every other border settlement from here to the coast." Murbul's stomach turned to stone. "You mean to have me court him, in truth or in seeming?" "In seeming," Goreth said, "which is all that matters to treaty law. You will go to him. You will propose the claim bond, as is your right as my enforcer and my blood. He will almost certainly accept, for it will spare his little way station from being burned and spare him. Besides, word has reached me that certain men of Ashford Hollow already look for reasons to drive him from that ridge, sympathizer that he is. You will remain close to him. You will learn what you can of the fort the humans plan to build, and when the time comes when I judge it right, the bond will end cleanly, and the pass will remain contested ground as it was always meant to be. No fires, no blood. Only patience and your considerable talent for making yourself feared. And if I do not wish to do this—" Goreth studied his daughter for a long moment, and something almost gentle crossed his weathered face. "You have never once in your life refused a task I set you, Murbul. I do not think you will start now, even for a human who feeds you stew." He paused. "Though I confess, I did not expect to see you hesitate over it at all." She did not answer that either. She turned on her heel and left the fire, and if her heart beat faster on the long ride back up toward Frostgate Pass than any battle had ever made it beat, she told herself, fiercely and not quite believingly, that it was only the cold. Jacob was mending a harness strap on the porch of the way station when she rode up out of the gray morning mist, and he set the leather aside slowly, the same careful stillness as before, though this time there was no hammer raised, no threat in her posture, only a strange, guarded uncertainty that looked almost foreign on features built for command. "You came back," he said. "I take it your father wasn't pleased with your report." "He was not," Murbul said, dismounting with the fluid ease of a woman who had spent her whole life on horseback. "He has another plan now, one that requires your cooperation, human, and I confess I do not know how you will take it." "Try me," Jacob said. "I've survived stranger mornings." So she told him of the claim bond, of the old treaty custom, of her father's design to use a false courtship to protect the pass and gather what knowledge he could of the coming fort. She laid it out plainly, without flourish, watching his face for the fear or the outrage she half expected. Instead, Jacob was quiet for a long moment, turning the harness strap over in his hands, and when he spoke his voice was thoughtful rather than alarmed. "So you're asking me to pretend to court you," he said, "so that your father can spy on me and my neighbors, and in exchange my way station doesn't burn. That is the shape of it, yes. And what happens to you if your father decides later that the pretending should end?" The question surprised her, not the terms of it, but that he had thought to ask at all, that his first concern seemed to be for her position and not merely his own stake in the bargain. "I do as I am told," she said. "I always have." Jacob nodded slowly, as though weighing something far larger than a simple bargain. "All right," he said. "I'll do it. Not because I'm afraid of your father's fires, though I won't pretend that's no consideration at all, but because I think you didn't want to come back here and ask me this, and you did it anyway because it was your duty, and I respect that more than I'd respect a man who came at me with a blade instead of a hard choice." He held out his hand, the same gesture he might have offered any trading partner sealing a deal. "Pretend courtship it is, Murbul Doomhammer, though I hope you know I make terrible small talk for a suitor." She looked at his offered hand for a long moment before she took it, her grip swallowing his entirely calloused palm against calloused palm, and something passed between them in that touch that neither of them had a name for yet, something that had nothing at all to do with treaties or land or father's schemes. "We will see," she said, "how terrible you truly are." What began as pretense unspooled over the weeks that followed into something neither of them had bargained for. She came to the way station 3, sometimes 4 days out of every week, ostensibly to maintain the appearance of the claim bond, to be seen riding the pass at his side by whatever eyes her father had watching. In practice, she found herself lingering long past any strategic necessity, sitting across from him at the rough table while he told her stories of the fighting pits, not the glory of them, which he had none, but the strange camaraderie of broken men who understood each other in ways no one outside the ring ever could. She found herself, one bitter evening when the wind howled loud enough to rattle the shutters, teaching him the proper grip for a war hammer, guiding his hands over the haft, correcting his stance with a bluntness that made him laugh even as he stumbled. And she found, to her own quiet astonishment, that she liked his laugh more than she had liked anything in a very long time. The proximity was, from the first week, a kind of slow torment neither of them spoke aloud. The way station had only the one large room besides the small loft where Jacob kept his stores, and on the nights when the snow fell too thick for her to ride back to Blackridge Camp, she slept by the fire on a pallet of furs while he took the loft, and more than once he woke in the gray hour before dawn to find her already awake below, watching the flames, and something in him ached to climb down and sit beside her rather than call good morning from the ladder like a coward. It was over the mending of a torn coat sleeve, 3 weeks into the arrangement, that the pretense finally, irrevocably cracked. She had torn it on a branch riding up through the tree line, and rather than let him fetch a needle himself, she had simply sat at his table and begun stitching it herself with brisk, economical motions, her tongue caught briefly between her teeth in concentration, a small, human gesture that struck Jacob as unbearably endearing on a woman who could break a man's arm without much effort. "You're staring," she said, without looking up. "I am," Jacob admitted, because lying to her had never once worked and he'd stopped trying weeks ago. "Why?" "Because I like watching you," he said simply. "I like the way you frown when the thread knots. I like that you came all this way in the cold to sew a coat sleeve instead of asking me to do it, even though you hate needlework and told me so twice already." Murbul's hand stilled on the fabric. She set the coat down slowly and looked up at him, and there was none of the fierce mask she wore for her clan, none of the enforcer's cold command, only a woman, uncertain, on the edge of something she had not let herself want in longer than she could remember. "This was meant to be pretense," she said, though it sounded less like a reminder to him and more like one to herself. "I know," Jacob said. He did not move from where he stood by the hearth, did not close the distance between them, though every part of him wanted to. "I know that's what we agreed, but I haven't been pretending in a long while, Murbul. I don't know when it stopped. Maybe it never started, not really. Maybe I offered you that seat by the fire the first night because some fool part of me already knew." "You do not fear me," she said, and it was not a question this time, but something closer to wonder. "I fear plenty of things," Jacob said. "I fear the winters up here alone. I fear the day some fool from Ashford Hollow decides my way station's worth burning over the company I keep. But you," he shook his head slowly, and crossed the room at last, kneeling before her chair so that their eyes were level, an act of humility he had not offered another living soul since his last bout in the pits. "I have never once been afraid of you, Murbul Doomhammer. I think I have wanted, since that very first night, for you to look at me the way you're looking at me right now." She reached out and touched the scar through his eyebrow, the one from some long-ago fight he never spoke of in detail, and her fingers were gentler than he had ever imagined such a powerful hand could be. "My father will not be pleased," she murmured, to learn his enforcer forgot her orders so thoroughly. "Then don't tell him," Jacob said, "until we've decided together what we mean to do about it." She kissed him first, of course she did, for she had never in her life waited for another to make the first move toward anything she wanted, and she wanted this, wanted him, with a hunger that startled her in its suddenness and its depth. Her hand slid to the back of his neck, tusks brushing careful against his jaw, and Jacob rose into the kiss with both hands finding her waist, the leather of her bodice warm from the fire. And for a long, breathless moment the waystation, the treaty, the flood of politics neither of them had asked for. All of it fell away into nothing but the two of them and the crackling hearth and the storm beginning softly to howl outside. When at last they broke apart, both a little unsteady, Murbul rested her forehead briefly against his. "This was not the plan," she said again, though there was a smile threading through the words now, small and real. "No," Jacob agreed. "It's a much better one." Word of the arrangement, the claim bond, if not yet the truth beneath it, reached Ashford Hollow within a fortnight, as such things always did, carried down the mountain road on the tongues of wagon drivers and traders. It reached the town's market square on a bright, brutally cold morning when Jacob and Murbul rode down together to trade furs and buy salt. And it was there, among the stalls and the frost-rimed awnings, that the town's prejudice showed its ugliest face. A knot of men had gathered near the well by the time their wagon rolled to a stop, and Jacob recognized the leader among them at once, Havard Prout, a red-faced grain merchant who had never once forgiven Jacob for trading fairly with orc caravans, and who now stood with a hunting spear gripped white-knuckled in one fist. "Dawson's brought his orc whore into decent company," Prout called out, loud enough for the whole square to hear, and a murmur of ugly agreement rippled through the gathering crowd. "You'd sell this town out to Doomhammer's raiders for a warm bed, is that it?" Jacob was off the wagon before the words had finished leaving Prout's mouth, stepping between the man's leveled spear and Murbul with no more hesitation than he'd have shown stepping between a child and a falling beam. "Say what you like about me," Jacob said, low and even, though there was iron beneath the calm now, the same iron that had once made grown men in the pits hesitate before facing him. "But you'll lower that spear before you finish whatever sentence you think you're building, Havard, or I'll remind this whole square why they used to pay good coin to watch me fight." "He threatens a fellow townsman to defend an orc," Prout spat, but his spear wavered because he remembered too, as half the men in that square remembered, exactly what Jacob Dawson had once been capable of in a ring with far less reason to fight than this. Behind Jacob, Murbul had gone very still, and it was the stillness of a predator deciding whether restraint was still worth the effort. Her hand had drifted to the haft of her war hammer, and one word from Jacob, one flicker of true danger, and Havard Prout would have found himself flat on the frozen ground with far worse than bruised pride. But Jacob did not give that word. He kept his eyes on Prout, kept his voice level, and said only, "This woman has done more to keep peace on that pass than any man in this square, myself included. If you want to test whether she deserves your fear, Havard, you're welcome to try. I promise you I won't stop her this time." The square held its breath. Then slowly, muttering, the crowd's courage failed them, as crowds so often did when the true cost of their hatred was made to stand plainly before them, and Prout lowered the spear, spitting once into the snow before turning away, his followers dispersing after him in twos and threes. Murbul let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "You did not let me break him." "No," Jacob agreed, "because if you had, it would have proven every ugly thing they already believe about you, and I won't hand them that victory. But I'll be damned if I let any man raise a spear at you in my hearing and walk away thinking it cost him nothing." She looked at him for a long moment in the cold morning light, snow settling on her dark braids and something in her chest, some wall she had built brick by brick over a lifetime of being feared rather than valued, cracked further still. "You stood between me and a blade," she said slowly, as though it were the simplest thing in the world. "It is the simplest thing in the world," Jacob said, "when it's you." The night the Ashfang raiders came, the moon hung full and merciless over Frostgate Pass, and Jacob would remember every detail of it for the rest of his life, sharp as a blade's edge. They had grown careless, perhaps, in their happiness or simply unlucky. For the Ashfang clan, rivals of the Doomhammer line for grazing rights along the southern ridges, had learned of Murbul's frequent presence at the humans' way station, and saw in it either a grievous insult to be punished or a rare chance to strike at Chief Gorath's own blood, while she sat undefended among strangers. Either way, they came at midnight, a dozen strong, torches guttering against the snow, and the first Jacob knew of it was the sound of the stable door being torn from its frame and his mule screaming in the dark. "Raiders," Murbul said, already on her feet, hammer in hand before Jacob had even finished blinking sleep from his eyes. "Ashfang colors, get behind me." "Not a chance," Jacob said, and reached instead for the old training sword he kept mounted above the hearth, not the crude tool of a farmer, but a true duelist's blade, kept oiled and sharp out of habit long after he'd told himself he'd never draw it again in earnest. They burst out of the way station together, back to back in the narrow doorway, and the sight that met them was a ring of torchlight and snarling faces, a dozen Ashfang raiders fanning out across the yard with axes and spears, firelight glinting off tusks bared in eager anticipation of easy prey. "Doomhammer's little pet," one of them called, a broad-shouldered brute with a scar splitting one cheek, clearly their leader. "Kruk did not think he would find you so far from your father's protection, enforcer. Perhaps we take your head back to Blackridge Camp as a gift, and the humans besides, for good measure." "You are welcome to try, Kruk," Murbul snarled back, and there was no fear in her voice at all, only the cold, ready fury of a woman who had never once lost a fight she chose to have. "Though I promise you'll leave more of yourself in this snow than you brought with you." The raiders came all at once, and the yard erupted into chaos. Jacob had not fought in earnest in 3 years, had told himself countless times that part of his life was closed, buried with the friend he'd killed in his final bout. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget, and his blade came up in time to catch the first axe blow on instinct alone, steel ringing against steel in the frozen dark. He gave ground, found his footing, and beside him, truly beside him, her back a solid, unyielding warmth against his own Murbul's hammer crashed down with a sound like a felled tree, scattering 2 raiders who had thought to flank her. "Watch your left," she barked, and he did, ducking a spear thrust by a hair's breadth, driving his own blade up into the gap beneath a raider's ribs with the same cold economy the pits had once taught him. He felt no triumph in it, only the grim necessity of survival, and beside him Murbul fought like something out of an old war song, hammer sweeping in great, brutal arcs, her braids flying, a snarl on her lips that would have frightened any sane man into flight. But there were too many of them, and Jacob felt it in the growing ache of his arms, in the raiders regrouping faster than they could fell them, and when Kruk himself finally came at Murbul with an axe raised high, roaring some old grudge about her father's rule, Jacob saw the blow coming a half-second before it landed and threw himself into its path without a single thought for his own safety. The axe caught him across the ribs, a glancing blow but a vicious one, and he went down hard into the bloodied snow, breath torn from his lungs in a white gasp. "Jacob!" Murbul's voice cracked with something raw and terrible, and whatever restraint had governed her fighting until that moment vanished entirely. What happened next, the survivors of that raid would speak of for years afterward in hushed, uneasy tones. Murbul Doomhammer, enforcer of Blackridge Camp, undefeated in single combat since she was old enough to lift a blade, became something closer to a force of nature than a woman. Kruk's axe met her hammer and shattered on the second blow, and the raiders who had come seeking an easy prize found themselves instead facing a fury that did not tire, did not slow, did not stop until the last of them had fled screaming back down the mountain, leaving 3 of their number dead in the snow, and the rest limping for their lives. Only when the last torch had vanished into the tree line did she turn, dropping to her knees beside Jacob in the bloodied snow, hands trembling, hands that had just broken bone and shattered steel without hesitation, now shaking as they hovered over his wound, afraid to touch him wrong. "Don't you dare," she said, voice cracking. "Don't you dare die on me, human. Not now, not after everything." "Wasn't planning on it," Jacob managed, though the words came out thin and pained. "Ribs. Not the first time I've broken a few. Help me up before I freeze to the ground, if you don't mind." She did not simply help him up. She lifted him bodily, as though he weighed nothing at all, and carried him back through the ruined doorway of the way station, laying him by the fire with a care so at odds with the violence she had just visited on their enemies that Jacob, through the haze of pain, found himself smiling. "What," she demanded, tearing strips from a clean shirt to bind his ribs, "is so amusing?" "You," Jacob said, "terrifying the Ashfang clan half to death and then fretting over me like I'm made of glass." "You very nearly were made of glass," she snapped, though her hands were gentle as she bound the wound, gentle in a way that betrayed everything her voice tried to deny. "You threw yourself in front of an axe for me." "I'd do it again," Jacob said, catching her hand before she could pull away, holding it against his chest where she could feel his heart still beating, stubborn and steady beneath the pain. "I told you once I've never been afraid of you, Murbul. I meant it. But I have never once in my whole life been afraid for someone the way I was tonight, watching that axe come at you." She stared down at him for a long moment, firelight flickering across her fierce, exhausted face, and something in her, the last of the wall, the last remnant of duty pretending to be all that bound them, finally, completely gave way. "I forgot my orders that first night," she whispered, "when you offered me a seat instead of running. I told myself for weeks it was strategy, that I played the courtship only for my father's sake. I do not believe that any longer. I have not believed it in a long while, if I am honest, and I am done pretending otherwise to my father or to myself." She lifted his hand, pressed it against her own chest in turn, over the fierce, unsteady drum of her heart. "You matter to me more than any claim bond, Jacob Dawson, more than any orders my father could ever give." "Good," Jacob said, wincing through a smile, "because I don't think I could survive pretending much longer either." He healed slowly over the following days, tended by her hands with a patience that surprised even her. And when word of the Ashfang raid reached Blackridge Camp along with the far more startling news of exactly how fiercely his daughter had fought to defend a human, she had been sent only to frighten Chief. Murbul Doomhammer rode up to Frostgate Pass himself for the first time in years, to see the truth of it with his own eyes. He found his daughter kneeling by the hearth, changing the dressing on a human's ribs with her own two hands, murmuring something too low for even his sharp ears to catch, and the human looking up at her, not with the fear Goreth had expected to find, but with a tenderness so plain it needed no translation at all. "Murbul," Goreth said from the broken doorway, broken twice now, though this time by an axe rather than a fist end, both of them startled, Murbul rising at once, chin lifting into the old defiant posture, ready for whatever judgment her father brought. "Father, I did not expect you." "Clearly not," Goreth said, gaze moving slowly between the two of them, taking in the bandages, the closeness, the way his daughter had positioned herself, without seeming to notice she'd done it, slightly between him and the wounded human, as though even now some instinct in her stood guard. "I sent you to play a part, daughter. It seems you have written yourself an entirely different story." "I have," Murbul said, and there was no apology in it. "I forgot my orders the very first night, Father, when he offered me a seat by his fire instead of running from my hammer. I have spent every day since pretending otherwise, to you and to myself, and I am done with the pretending. I love this man. I will not give him up, not for the claim bond, not for the pass, not for anything you might threat." Goreth was silent a long while, and Jacob, still weak from his wound, found himself holding his breath, waiting for the chieftain's fury. Instead, Goreth's scarred face slowly, almost reluctantly, softened. "The Ashfang raiders came at midnight and found you fighting at his side rather than sheltering behind him," he said. "I have heard the accounts. 3 of them dead, the rest broken and fled. I have not seen you fight with such fury in all your years as my enforcer, Murbul, not even in defense of your own kin. He looked at Jacob, considering. You threw yourself before an axe meant for my daughter, human. I did, Jacob said, meeting the chieftain's gaze without flinching, though every rib ached with the effort of sitting upright. I'd do it again without hesitation, sir. I know I'm not what you'd have chosen for her. I know the treaty, the claim bond, all of it was meant to be a game your daughter and I were only pretending to play. But I love her. I don't expect that to matter much to a mountain, but it's the truest thing I've got to offer you. Goreth studied him a long moment, then let out a short, gruff laugh that startled them both. Mountains, he said, have been known to move given enough patience and the right pressure. Perhaps love is simply patience that finally finds its leverage. He looked to his daughter. The claim bond was meant to end, Murbul, once its purpose was served. I release you from that plan if this is truly what you want instead. It is, Murbul said, without a moment's hesitation. Then we will speak more of it, Goreth said, once a more pressing matter is settled. I did not ride up this mountain only to witness my daughter's heart, though I confess I am glad I did. There is worse news from Blackridge Camp, and from what the wind carries down from the high glacier. The ice dam at Shale Narrows, he told them, had begun to crack. It was an old danger, one both peoples had lived beneath for generations, the great glacial dam of the Frostspine, which held back the meltwaters of 100 winters until the spring thaw finally forced its breaking, sending a wall of water and ice thundering down through the valley below. In most years the breaking, as it was called, came gradually, a slow release the river channels could manage. But this winter had been fiercer and longer than most, and the scouts of Blackridge Camp had returned with word that the dam groaned and shifted with unnatural violence, threatening to give way all at once rather than in its usual gradual collapse, a wall of water and ice that would scour the valley clean, sweeping away Blackridge Camp's lower tents, the road down to Ashford Hollow and Frostgate Way Station itself, all in a single catastrophic night, unless something was done to slow it. How long do we have? Jacob asked, pushing himself upright despite the pain, despite Murbul's hand on his shoulder trying to press him back down. Days, Goreth said grimly. A week at most if the scouts read the ice rightly. Long enough to warn the camps below, perhaps, if every rider we have is put to the task at once. Not long enough to build any true defense. There's a defense, Jacob said slowly, an old idea forming, born of years spent studying the mountain from his porch, of watching the way water moved through the narrow channels below the pass. Not to stop the flood. No one could stop a flood that size. But to divert it, to widen the old dry channel east of the way station, the one that hasn't run with water in a generation, and give the worst of the surge somewhere to go besides straight through Blackridge Camp and down onto Ashford Hollow. It would need trenching, and fast, and more hands than I have. You would have us dig a channel to save the very town that raised a spear against your woman, Goreth said, not quite believing it. I'd have us dig a channel to save everyone who might drown otherwise, Jacob said. Ashford Hollow's got fools in it same as anywhere, but it's got children too, and old folk who never raised a spear at anyone. I won't let them drown for the sins of a few loud men, any more than I'd let your people drown for old grudges neither of us started. Goreth looked at him for a long moment, then at his daughter, and whatever he saw in both their faces settled something in him. Then we dig, he said, and we warn both camps, human and orc alike, and we pray to whatever gods still listen on this mountain that it is enough. The days that followed were the hardest either of them had ever lived through, and also, strangely, some of the most alive Jacob had felt since the fighting pits, not because of violence, but because of purpose, shared fully and completely with the woman beside him. Murbul rode down to Blackridge Camp and returned with 24 orc warriors bearing picks and shovels fashioned from whatever iron the camp's smiths could spare, while Jacob rode, still favoring his bound ribs, down the long road to Ashford Hollow to warn the town himself, bracing for the same hatred that had greeted them in the market square. He found, instead, something he had not expected. Havard proved himself, red-faced and grudging, was among the first to volunteer picks and hands once the scope of the danger was made plain. For whatever else the man believed about orcs, he loved his own children more than his prejudice, and a flood that would drown them both equally cared nothing for grudges. Captain Elspeth Marrow of the Town Watch, a stern woman Jacob had known since his pit-fighting days, organized wagons of workers and tools within the hour, and by nightfall a strange and unprecedented sight had begun to take shape on the eastern slope of Frostgate Pass. Humans and orcs, side by side, trenching the old dry channel wider by torchlight, the ring of picks against frozen ground echoing long into the night. It was backbreaking, desperate work, and twice more in those days the ground shook with warning tremors from the glacier above, sending workers scrambling for higher ground before returning, grimly, to their tools. Jacob worked until his bound ribs screamed in protest, and Murbul finally forced him to rest by simply picking him up and carrying him bodily away from the trench, an act that drew startled laughter from more than one orc warrior and no small amount of teasing that followed him for days after. On the fifth night, the dam broke. The sound of it reached them long before the water did, a deep, groaning roar like the mountain itself crying out, followed by a distant crack that split the night air like thunder. And then, rising over the tree-lined downslope, a white wall of foam and ice catching the moonlight as it began its thundering descent. "Channel's not finished," someone shouted, and chaos rippled through the gathered workers, humans and orcs alike scrambling for the last few crucial lengths of trench that stood between disaster and salvation. "There's no time," Captain Marrow called, voice cracking with the effort of being heard over the growing roar. "There has to be," Jacob said, and without thinking, without any plan beyond desperate necessity, he grabbed a length of rope from the nearest wagon and began lashing together a makeshift barrier of logs and stone at the trench's unfinished edge, shouting for others to do the same, to buy even a few precious minutes. Murbul was at his side in an instant, hammer discarded, hauling stone with her bare hands faster than 3 men combined. And around them, the strange alliance of the past days held firm, even in the face of terror-orc warriors and human townsfolk hauling logs and packing earth together with no thought now for old grudges, only for the wall of water bearing down on all of them equally. The flood struck the channel with a violence that shook the ground beneath their feet, spray flying high into the moonlit air, and for one heart-stopping moment Jacob thought their work had failed entirely, that the surge would simply overwhelm the trench and continue on its path of destruction toward both camps below. But the channel held barely, roaring at its banks, throwing icy spray 100 feet into the air, and the bulk of the flood's fury, diverted, went thundering harmlessly down the old dry riverbed and out across the empty scrubland to the east, where it could do no more harm than frighten a few startled elk. A cheer went up from the exhausted workers, human and orc voices mingling in a way Frostgate Pass had likely never heard before, and Jacob, soaked to the bone and shaking with exhaustion and relief, found himself pulled into Murbul's arms so fiercely it nearly cracked his already bruised ribs anew. "You mad, brilliant man," she said into his hair, voice thick with an emotion she made no effort now to hide. "You saved them, all of them." "We saved them," Jacob corrected, breathless, laughing despite the ache in his side. "Every last one of us together." In the days that followed the breaking, something in Ashford Hollow shifted that no treaty, no old accord, no clever diplomacy could ever have accomplished on its own. Havard Prout, of all people, was seen shaking hands with an orc warrior of Blackridge Camp at the town well, gruff and awkward but sincere, and Captain Elspeth Marrow proposed, before the whole gathered town council, that the old plans for a garrison fort on Frostgate Pass be abandoned entirely in favor of a shared watch station, built jointly by human and orc hands, to stand guard over the crossing for both peoples together. Chief Murbul Doomhammer, standing at the edge of that council meeting with his daughter beside him, watched the vote pass with something like wonder on his scarred old face. "I sent you to frighten a man off this mountain," he said quietly to Murbul, as the townsfolk and clan warriors began the slow, unfamiliar work of shaking hands and sharing food in the market square below. "Instead, you have done something no army, no treaty, no chieftain in 3 generations managed to accomplish. You found a bridge, daughter, where the rest of us only ever found a wall." "I did not find it alone," Murbul said, looking to where Jacob stood at the edge of the square, exhausted, bruised, and smiling despite it all as old Fenwick clapped him on the shoulder in congratulation. "I found it because he offered me a seat instead of running, father, and I was too foolish or too fortunate to remember my orders after that." That night, when the fires of celebration in Ashford Hollow had burned low, and the exhausted town had finally gone quiet, Jacob and Murbul rode back up the mountain together to the way station, its door once more standing whole and solid on its hinges, and continued past it, up the last steep switchback to the very crest of Frostgate Pass, where the world opened out beneath a sky ablaze with the shifting green and violet fire of the northern lights. They stood together at the edge of that vast open dark, the ruined channel of the diverted flood a pale silver ribbon far below, the lights of Ashford Hollow and the distant fires of Blackridge Camp both glowing faintly in the valley. 2 peoples who had, for one impossible night, forgotten to be enemies. "There is a custom among my people," Murbul said quietly, turning to face him fully, the aurora painting shifting colors across her features, "for when an enforcer chooses to claim a mate for herself, rather than for any clan strategy. It has not been done in my father's memory. It requires no council, no treaty, no scroll of old law, only truth, spoken freely beneath open sky." "Then tell me the truth," Jacob said, reaching up to brush a strand of dark hair from her face, his heart hammering harder than it ever had in any pit fight. "I've got nothing to offer you but this mountain and this way station, and whatever's left of a man who used to break bones for coin. But it's yours, Murbul, all of it, if you'll have it." "I do not want your mountain," she said, low and fierce, closing what little distance remained between them. "I do not want your way station, or your coin, or your old fights. I want you, Jacob Dawson. I chose to remain that first night for reasons I did not understand, and I have chosen you again, freely, every single day since, and I mean to go on choosing you for as long as the northern lights burn in the sky." "Then claim me," Jacob said, voice rough with everything he felt and had no better words for. "I'm already yours. I think I have been since the moment you kicked in my door." She kissed him then beneath the shifting fire of the aurora, no pretense left between them at all, only 2 hearts finally, fully unguarded. And when she drew back just far enough to press her forehead to his, tusks gentle against his skin, her hands framing his face with a tenderness that would have shocked anyone who had ever feared the name Doomhammer, Jacob felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, entirely and completely found. "I am yours," she murmured against his lips, "and you are mine, Jacob Dawson, before this sky and this mountain and whatever gods still watch over us both. Let my father call it strategy if he likes. Let the whole valley call it whatever they please. I know now what it is, and I will not let it go." "Neither will I," Jacob said, and drew her down beside him into the snow at the very crest of the world, where the lights danced on undisturbed above them, where 2 people's old hatreds had finally, however briefly, given way to something braver and far more lasting, and where a fierce orc enforcer sent to frighten a lonely man off his mountain had instead, against every order she had ever been given, found in him a home she never meant to leave. They stayed there long into the night, wrapped together against the cold, watching the aurora burn its slow, silent fire across the northern sky, and when at last they rode back down toward the way station as the first gray light of dawn touched the peaks, neither of them spoke of pretense or duty or orders ever again. There was no need. Whatever they had begun as strangers across a bowl of stew, they finished now as something far greater, 2 people, human and orc, who had weathered fire and flood and every old hatred the world could throw between them, and had chosen, again and again, to stand together instead. The waystation door, mended twice over now against axe and fist alike, stood open to greet them as the sun rose fully over Frostgate Pass, warm light spilling across the snow, and Murbul Doomhammer walked through it at Jacob Dawson's side, not as an enforcer sent to conquer, nor as a woman playing a part assigned to her, but simply, finally, as a woman coming home.